All right, today's presentation is called Local Food and Local Solutions, Advocating for No-Cost Wireless SNAP Equipment at Farm Direct Outlets. It'll be presented by Kate Fitzgerald and hosted by Farmers Market Coalition in partnership with the Nutrition Incentive Hub. A little bit about the Hub. It's a new national resource created by the GUSNIP NTAE Center for those working to launch or expand nutrition incentive programs. The Nutrition Incentive Hub is funded through the 2018 Farm Bill and through a cooperative agreement with USDA and NIFA. The Hub is a national coalition made up of partners that provide training, technical assistance, and evaluation for SNAP incentive and produce prescription programs. Our main objective is to strengthen access to fruits and vegetables, and we were created primarily to support awardees of the Gus Schumacher Nutrition Incentive Program grant, GUSNIP, formerly FINI, but we do offer some form of training and TA to all nutrition incentive practitioners. Here are the GUSNIP goals, and these are available on the Nutrition Incentive Hub website. Here's kind of a makeup of the coalition of partners. A little bit about FMC. I think we're all pretty familiar. If we're not, we're Farmers Market Coalition, and we exist to strengthen farmers markets for the benefit of farmers, consumers, and communities. We are focused on supporting market operators in their work and advocating for farmers markets to external stakeholders and decision makers. And you can get more info about us on our website, farmersmarketcoalition.org. And then our role in the Hub. So we lead technical and training assistance and innovation for farm direct outlets, including farmers markets, farm stands, and CSA programs. And we do this in collaboration with the Ecology Center and the Michigan Farmers Market Association. All right, so a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Any questions you have during the presentation, go ahead and add them in the chat. We have a couple of FMC team members monitoring the chat, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the presentation and then just talk about them live. All the questions are going to be transcribed, and I'm going to make them into a Q&A page and then send those out along with a recording of today's presentation and the slides. And those will also be available on the FMC resource library page. So at the end, you'll get one more email from me with all the resources from today. So I will hand it over to Ben to present Kate Fitzgerald. You're muted, Ben.
And I was saying such wonderful things about Kate too. I guess I'll just have to say them again. So yeah, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Kate Fitzgerald. Kate Fitzgerald has been a longtime advocate and supporter of federal nutrition assistance programs. She's currently based in Washington, D.C., and over the course of the last 2 Farm Bill cycles, if we think about this program that's named after Gus Schumacher, if he's the architect, I guess Kate might be thought of as the general contractor. Kate has done really much of the heavy lifting in getting this program to where it is today. In fact, the Centers for Excellence, these are ideas that came and that Kate was able to get into the national program, and really prior to the existence of the Food Insecurity and Nutrition Incentive Program in the federal Farm Bill, this was not a federal program. And like I said, Kate, perhaps more than anybody else, deserves credit for the elevation of the incentive programs into federal programs, but her work to support healthy food access does not begin there, and it doesn't end there. Kate's work, as many of you may know, goes all the way back to her work in Texas, founding Sustainable Food Center, as well as working in the Hightower administration. And I'm thrilled that she's joining us today. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Kate. Kate, go ahead and take it away.
Hi, please take this picture off the screen. It's very disconcerting to be looking at myself. Thank you so much for that overly generous introduction, Ben. And it's wonderful to be back with my people, which is what this feels like. And I hope I can keep you engaged on the kind of arcane subject of state SNAP contracts. And this has been, some of you may well know, a particular passion of mine for the last more years than I like to think about. The basic idea is to set up a system whereby all farmers markets have essentially automatic access to wireless EBT equipment and service once they become SNAP authorized. It is designed to ensure the basics of two markets to allow them to serve SNAP sharpers. It is EBT only equipment, but it creates essentially a level playing field so that farmers markets do not have to absorb a burden to serve these shoppers. Markets can always choose to do something more ambitious and buy their own or lease their own equipment, but the idea is to just make sure that all that cost does not preclude markets from serving these shoppers. And the basic way to do that is by having language written into your state's SNAP processing contract requiring the processing company to provide the service. Next slide, please. So, what are state processing contracts? The way the SNAP program works is the federal government, USDA, FNS, oversees the program and essentially acts as a regulatory agency. But it's the State Department of Social Services or Health and Human Services that actually run the program in their states, with a couple of caveats. Retailers, and this includes farmers markets, are authorized by the federal government, not by the state agency. But the state agency is the department that authorizes all the SNAP recipients in the state and essentially performs all the administrative functions to make sure that the program works day in and day out for the SNAP households. The way they do that is by contracting with independent companies to provide the package of services that makes the programs run. That will include the processing service, so the very basic function of when I go down to my farmer's market or my grocery store to buy food with my EBT card, this SNAP processing company is the entity that actually makes that financial transaction happen. The SNAP processor also often issues the card. So when I get my card in the mail, it comes from the processing company. If I lose my card or have a question and call the 800 number, that question is answered by a staff person for the state processing company, almost always, not by a state agency person. So the contractors are really very, very important. They make the program work day in and day out in the state. And the state agency contracts with these companies for multi-year contracts at about 5 years apart. So you've got the state, you've got FNS at the federal level overseeing the work. Then you have your state SNAP agency managing the program in the state and contracting with an outside business to perform these functions. The contracts, as I've said, generally last around 5 years. They're long and they're complex, and they take a couple of years to negotiate. Many states will bundle together their contracts for SNAP, WIC, and TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is like a cash benefit. and put out a bid to provide service to all of the programs at once. Not all states do that, but some do. While the contractors provide a bunch of services, one of the core ones and the only one that we'll be talking about and that I think is of immediate interest to the farmers market community is processing payments. Next slide, please. So what does it look like? There are basically two companies that manage the contracts in 48 of the 50 states. The green states have contracts with a company called FIS. The purple states are with Conduent. Montana is with Solutran. Louisiana is with Inmar, which is interesting because this contract is less than a year old, and it is the first time that the company Inmar has had a processing contract with the state. Puerto Rico is differently. They are managed by a processor that is based in the Caribbean called Evertech. So what you see is what looks a lot like a monopsony. Next slide, please. So what does the contract process look like? And on the one hand, it is correct that the contracts are complex because they include so much explicit language about so many different things. But I don't want you to be over intimidated because the one piece that is important to farmers markets is pretty straightforward, easy to find in the contracts, and you can really engage successfully without having to worry about 99% of the other language in there. So the way it works is that state agencies will start talking with their staff, with Food and Nutrition Service, and sometimes with other neighbor states about 2 years before their current contract expires to consider the functions or the characteristics or the criteria that they want going forward. Many states hire professional consultants to help them write the request for proposals. And some of you may have met Peter Relic or listened to the very excellent webinar that he gave for FMC last year explaining this process. He is an example of the kind of person who works with a state to write their proposal. So usually they're called RFAs. I put down on here invitation to negotiate, which is what Florida calls it because I just think it's so funny. It just puts straight out there that, well, yeah, let's just be very clear that this is going to be a negotiation process. You will not necessarily, it would be unlikely for you to know when the request for proposals comes out because it's not something that most people in the world are interested in. It generally will go up somewhere on a state procurement website. They'll be publicly available, but it's not something that is ballyhooed. So it's really important to have a relationship with your state agency in advance so you don't miss the window of opportunity to let them know what's important to the markets. Generally, the way it works is an RFP goes out. They then invite all of the interested contractors often to come together in person with the state agency to ask questions and discuss the text of the document. Then there will be a formal frequently asked questions, again, often posted on the state agency website. And the bid will be open for multiple months, several months. During the time period after the request for proposals is issued and before the bids are accepted, state agency personnel are not allowed to share information with outside entities. That is important for, protecting the integrity of the process. So don't take it personally if you try to communicate about what's happening with your friends at the state agency and they're not forthcoming. They really are not allowed to. Once the bids have been closed, the state agency goes back, looks, compares. They will generally have some kind of scoring matrix. They are not required to choose the lowest cost bidder. They will have set the criteria that they want in advance. And then once they've chosen the company, and that process of choosing will again take multiple months. 5 or 6 is probably a good average. And then the supposed contractor and the state agency will go through the contract line by line and negotiate on each item and on the price for each. So once generally the time from which the bids are closed and a new contract is awarded is about a year. And then there is a multiple month transition period. So we're talking about a pretty prolonged contract process. Next slide, please. So who is it that actually does this? And this is also often where it can sometimes be confusing. As I mentioned, USDA Food and Nutrition Service is functionally an oversight and regulatory agency to the state departments. FNS has its main office in Alexandria, Virginia, and then it has 7 regional offices. Each regional office then has staff assigned to oversee the different FNS programs operated in the states in their region. Now, it turns out that, let's just confine our conversation to SNAP here. The main Alexandria-based SNAP policy office does not communicate directly with the FNS regional SNAP staff. Instead, there is in Alexandria a regional staff headquarters. This explains why sometimes messages can get mixed and muddled between FNS SNAP headquarters and what FNS SNAP regional staff understand. I hope that's helpful. It took me years to dope this out, but what has to happen is the FNS SNAP national staff send their policies to the FNS regional office staff, who then send it out to the agencies, to the regional SNAP staff. Now, the regional staff do have monthly calls, so just something to put in the back of your mind. If you are facing a situation where you're hearing one thing from Ben about what FNS SNAP headquarters are saying and another thing from your SNAP buddy in the FNS regional office, flag that to the FNS regional staff, and they will be able to get clarification through their process. Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent, but just, I know working with FNS can sometimes be very, very frustrating, but it's not that they're completely inept, it's that processes sometimes get in the way. So in regard to this, what the FNS regional office does is gives the state agencies the federal requirements for the contract. They then approve the draft request for proposals that the states are ready to send out, and finally approve the final contracts. Their job is just to make sure that the contracts conform with FNS rules and to encourage states to follow FNS recommendations. The FNS recommendations is important here because you may remember that way back in 2016, FNS National Office recommended to all of the states that they include a provision in their state contracts requiring no-cost wireless EBT service and equipment to markets. States are not required to do that, but it's a recommendation. So you got the FNS regional office overseeing the process. You've got the state SNAP program leadership. They are the ones who are conscious of how the program is working on the ground in their state, incorporating the federal requirements that they have to operate under, and they tell often a whole different office and sometimes a whole different agency that does the actual financial procurement of the contract. So when there's no reason for you to have a relationship with the procurement agency or the contracting staff within the state SNAP agency, but it is helpful to be aware that when you tell the state SNAP leadership what you want, they often are not involved in the nitty-gritty negotiation process that happens. So don't be surprised if they're not completely conversant with all of the details in their contract. That is handed off to a separate entity within the state. That will become important in a moment because it means that you need to give your chums at the SNAP agency very explicit direction on what is important to you. Next slide, please. So, what is the overall goal? The basic goal is to ensure that any farmer's market or farm stand that is authorized by FNS can always have, at no cost to themselves, dependable wireless equipment and service. Now, if this requirement is included in the state contract, it is then subject to FNS regulations that require that once a market is authorized, it gets its equipment automatically within 2 weeks. It requires that the state processing company provide training and technical assistance is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's important in the contracts to be clear that the market will be paying no costs whatsoever. FNS requires that broken equipment is replaced at no cost within 48 hours, and that when the state is transitioning at the end of one contract to the beginning of a new contract, that the processor provides equipment, replacement equipment, when the program changes to the markets. Next slide. So, getting back to the point of the importance of having a relationship with your SNAP agency and the role that your chums there will actually be playing once the contract is being negotiated. Assume that your state SNAP lead does not understand the way markets work, which is totally fine. You don't understand how SNAP authorization works for clients. That makes sense. What it does mean, though, is that you really want to provide as much explicit information to him or her as possible for them to take and inform the way they write the RFA and the instructions that they give to their procurement staff for reviewing the bids and negotiating the final contract. That means, for example, telling them exactly what kind of equipment you think is best and what doesn't work. Here's an example. Arkansas negotiated a new contract several years ago, and they included beautiful language in it, but then wireless equipment wasn't forthcoming. And we went back and read the contract, and it turns out that what the company said it was going to provide was obsolete. It was no longer in production. They scrambled and got a substitute, but the point being, you really want to give them that information because they don't know. Rural communities, I'm thinking about our friends in Montana. Is there wireless coverage or cell coverage? Are there companies that you know do not serve large parts of your state? If there are, it's very important to let your state agency know that. What are the cell or wireless carriers that serve different geographies? And then what are the services that are most important to you in terms of, for example, technical assistance? And this is something I think it's important to talk about. And I know that Amanda and Joe from MIFMA are on the call. Going beyond just the legal requirement that a processing company provides equipment and service to farmers markets, you all know that getting farmers authorized, answering questions for them, doing the back and forth negotiation takes time and energy, and not all state and many state agencies do not have the wherewithal to provide that. So if you really feel that those services are going to be important, being clear about that and having a conversation with your state agency about how that will be done and how it will be paid for is also important. Next slide, please. So there are several ways that this can work. Some states have absolutely awesome contracts. It is just automatic. Every farmer's market and direct marketing farmer, as soon as they get authorized, boom, 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 within 2 weeks, they have their equipment, they got the training, they got the technical assistance, and it works beautifully. Idaho is an example of that. California is an example of that. In those states, it's important to know that the state agency is really very committed to making it work, so applies some of their staff people hours to make it work. The next example is the contract provides that kind of full service, but only to a limited number of markets or direct marketing farmers. Hawaii is an example of that, and I think it's 25. And states do that if they they're trying to control their budgets, they're concerned about how expensive it could be, and they have an upper limit on how much they can afford to spend on this service. So they'll write in that this will be provided to a maximum number of markets. The third option, and I'm thinking about places like North Carolina and maybe Alabama, is there is a subsidy for the equipment, but it doesn't cover full costs. So for example, the state agency might negotiate a price per piece of equipment that the farmer's market can pay, but then they are required to pay every other additional service fees. And then the worst is that it's just not even referenced at all. Next slide. So how does this interact with FNS's free equipment program? And this is an area where there is a lot of confusion, and I think it's really important to be very, very clear. Including this kind of language in your state contract is going to limit you to just EBT equipment. The federal dollars that flow through the states through this funding mechanism will not pay for equipment or service for credit or debit transactions. FNS's grant program that gives out every year will cover, at least in the first year, those supplemental payment tender costs, but it's only available to newly FNS authorized markets and farmers. So if your equipment died, your market's been authorized for 10 years, you can't use the free equipment program. If you are in a state with a state contract and you are using EBT only equipment, once it dies, it's just automatically replaced. There was a third grant program available for last year and this year through FNS, but I'll be glad to answer questions about that, but I'm not going to talk about it because it might just muddle the story here. Next slide. So where are we now? We're actually at a really exciting point because multiple states are either in the process of considering their new contracts now or are writing their RFP. Let's start with the green New England states. Those states operate, it's 7 states, and they work as a coalition. They issue an RFP together, they agree on a processing company together, and they individually then negotiate their contracts based on variable priorities for each state. They rotate the chairmanship essentially of that group, and at the moment, New York State is leading that work. That RFA is very well written, and it does not require, but it does ask for a price for the provision of wireless equipment and service. That means that the contractor who will be chosen, the processing company that will be chosen, will have in their bid exactly what service that they will provide and what it will cost each state agency. And then each state agency decides whether or not to take advantage of that. That decision is supposed to be made by June of this year. They will choose their processing company, then the negotiations will start, and the changeover, if they choose to go with a new company, will begin either end of this year or beginning of next year. Pennsylvania and New Jersey both either have their contracts out or are their RFPs out or have just closed their RFPs. So those 2 states are going to get new contracts soon. Pennsylvania did include the request for wireless equipment and service in their RFA. New Jersey didn't. Florida is in the same situation. Their RFP is out, is going to close any minute, and so they'll be making a choice, and they do have beautiful language asking for that service in theirs. Going over to the western states, this group of states, their current contracts expire next year, and they are right now in the process of hiring or have just hired the consultant to help them write their new RFP. Their last RFP included the request for language for wireless equipment, and some, but not all of the states chose to take FIS as the company there up on that. Idaho did, Washington did, New Mexico did, and Hawaii did. The other states opted out. And Colorado SNAP agency is the one that is leading those discussions. Next slide, please. So that's where we are. That's, I hope, made clear the whole process. And I'd be glad to answer any questions. What do you think?
Thanks so much, Kate. Yeah, this is tremendous. I think you see some of the you've probably been focused on it, but there's definitely been comments coming through that some of this clarification around how this all works is extremely helpful. I think, as you articulated, this is not necessarily the area of expertise for our farmers market state associations. So and so often what happens at FNS and state SNAP agencies is behind this, that veil of secrecy, right? Whether intentional or unintentional. And so, it's there is not a guide for this. So this is so helpful. Is the main sentiments that's coming through. A lot of folks are asking about whether we're sharing the PowerPoint and the recording, which of course will be shared. Have no concerns about that. As of yet, I don't think I've seen an actual question for you. So if folks
Really?
well, I think mostly people are still absorbing information. So I'm going to throw it open. If folks have questions, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask them, or type them in the chat, and we can go ahead and read them out for Kate. While we're waiting for that, Kate, I'm curious if if there's like one piece of guidance that you would suggest to folks in terms of how they approach the process for this. Like what's, if there's like one thing, if so many of these folks have limited resources, where is the kind of the most critical opportunity for action here?
Yes, I think that first of all, the trying to figure it out on your own is really not the way to go. Lean on FMC. Their staff is tremendous. They have got resources. They've been doing a lot of research, and the FMC staff will be able to, for example, tell you who the SNAP director is in your state, tell you who the FNS regional SNAP person is in your state. I would honestly say, I would suggest to everyone, just as good policy, that you introduce yourself to the state SNAP director and to your regional FNS SNAP person, and be in touch with them, just saying hello at least once a year. If your state does have a program, the contract does include the equipment, let the agency know what it means to you. If it is helpful, let them know. I have been told by SNAP directors that they said, well, we didn't include it because nobody ever told us to, or nobody ever said it was important. Don't assume that they know that you care about the program or that this is something that you would like. So that's where I would start. Introduce yourselves. Recognize that this is really a supplement to the basic core responsibilities that they have. I'm afraid sometimes I am over demanding. We have to be careful about being respectful of what their responsibilities are, and then just staying in touch and being clear.
Great. Thanks, Kate. So a related question here from Heather is about what point in the process is it best to reach out to the SNAP program leadership with explicit suggestions, those ideas around equipment, what it works and what doesn't?
Right. So what I would do is I would introduce yourself and find out what their contract schedule is. Now, FMC knows the answer to some of this for some of the states. So you can ask, I'm not sure who it will be, if it will be Katie Myrie, but if you can either get that from FMC, or when you introduce yourself to your state director, ask them, when is the contract up? And then I would say that you let them know before they start issuing the RFP. So for example, let's talk about the Western states. Right now is when people in Washington, Idaho, Nebraska, Arizona, New Mexico, Alaska, Hawaii, etc., should be letting their state agencies know, this is really important to us. Please include this in the RFP.
Great. Thanks, Kate. We've got another good question here from Margie, which is, how do they find a copy of the state contract? Can we plug it into a Google search?
Man, I often find it very hard. And honestly, pro tip, the FNS regional office, um, some of them that's why it helps to know them, because they'll tell you when the contracts are up, and they'll just share the link to wherever it is on the state's website. The other thing is, I'm thinking about Vermont having a relationship with the state agency. They can then direct you to it. So it's all just getting to know the people makes the process that much easier. And then once you get the contract, you can just do a search for farmers market and wireless, and it will take you through all the other stuff and take you right to the section you're interested in. Does that make sense? So I'd go with personal connections before just doing the Google.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. That's a very important suggestion. Having looked for some of those contracts, it can be extremely difficult, and there's not a consistent state approach to it. So that
Exactly.
absolutely is a great one. So let's see. Ian's got a question here, which is in regards to the free EBT tech through state SNAP offices. If our state's unable to administer the program, is there some way to work with FNS to require they get the tech out to markets? To my knowledge, no market in Montana has been able to access the free EBT equipment.
That's because, if I understand it, this is Tammy. This is a Montana question, a question coming from Montana?
It is, yes. And Tammy's been very central to this, and I'm just kind of following up for her.
Yeah. You know what is this exactly? The only equipment that Solutron will provide requires AT&T, which doesn't serve much of the state, is what I understand from Tammy.
That's clear. Thank you.
Sure. But that is just a super frustrating example of why it's important to provide this kind of coverage information to the state agency. It's a killer. Sorry that you're in that situation, Montana.
It's good. Thank you, Kate.
Sure.
So our questions are really starting to get rolling now. Reagan is asking, or saying our current contract expires in August. The current contractee is considering not continuing the contract. When do they have to decide? And can you say more about the transition period, as in who's responsible for the program? Is there in the several years that the contract is being written?
What state is this, please?
Reagan's in Utah.
Interesting. Okay, where's my list? So contracts can expire, but then they often have extensions, multiple year extensions. And I don't have Utah's right in front of me, but they are almost certainly working now on what's going to come next. The way it works is there is always an overlap. So if Utah decides not to continue with FIS and goes with another company, there will be a very closely regulated transition period when the two companies bit by bit hand over the delivery of services. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. I was just more, and also just like, when does this organization have to decide if they don't want to renew their contract?
Wait a minute, when does the SNAP agency have to decide?
The organization that's running SNAP right now. Yeah, when do they have to decide that they don't want to renew?
So the organization running SNAP for the whole state?
Yeah.
Which will be the Department of Human
Services.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not them, but the
contractor
that's actually running it. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time. This is getting down to the nitty-gritty, and I know there's a lot more questions that might have more universal application, but I can follow up with you after this if that's easier.
Okay.
Yeah, we can help try and facilitate clarification on that one, Reagan. So let's see, we're getting down to our last couple minutes, so I'm going to try and take a look at these. So one question here, and Dara's asking, are there places where that are like, say, gatherings, or what are the best opportunities to connect with these state SNAP administrators? Yeah, are there organizations or conferences where these state association leaders can make those connections?
Yes, and they do. There is the American Association of SNAP Directors, and it is managed by a national organization called the American Public Human Services Association. And Ben is meeting those folks. The staff person at the national organization is very familiar with farmers markets, has worked with farmers markets, and is interested in being helpful on this issue. They have a SNAP director monthly call, and they have an annual meeting at which there are presentations. I've been to 2 of them and tabled, and they're really lovely people. And yes, FMC will have a connection when Ben has a spare millisecond to meet with them.
So I think this may be our last question we have time for. Oops, and of course I just okay. So this is from Kelly. Kelly's in Arizona, and her question is: our state has told us there are currently not available to provide more machines, and have instituted a wait list until someone returns a machine. Any tips on how to navigate through this?
Yeah, Kelly, how are you? Yeah, absolutely. Now is the time. They are part of the Western Alliance that, well, first of all, I don't know what funding Arizona used for the equipment that they're distributing now. Maybe they used FNS's grant from last year. I don't know. But your contract does not include a requirement that FIS provide the no-cost equipment. Their RFP is being written now. Now is the time to be in touch with them and let them know that you would like to have Arizona provide the no-cost EBT only equipment and service to all markets, and you want that in the RFP.
Thanks, Kate. I think it looks like we actually might only have one more question. So I'm going to go ahead and one more explicit question. So I'm going to go ahead and get back to that one. And then maybe if folks have additional questions, we can just spend another minute here. So Amanda is asking, or maybe this is a statement, my mistake. So Amanda is saying, if an ABT contractor doesn't want to work with a state anymore, they would not respond to the state's RFP, and the state would have to decide which company to go through that did respond to the RFP. I see, there's no question here. My apologies, I think Amanda's just clarifying something in the chat, but is that accurate? So I think this may get to Reagan's question here. So it looks like we've gotten to the questions either through comments in the chat, where folks are helping each other out. That's one of the wonderful things.
Thank you very much, Amanda and Joe and Mifma.
Yeah, who, by the way, have a tremendous amount of expertise on this as well. And part of why this state and network leader group is so valuable, and why it's become such a resource for our state and network leaders, is because often the folks on the call have the answers themselves. So
yeah. Can I also flag one more thing, Ben?
Absolutely.
I noticed that the Florida folks are on, I think I saw Mary Hathaway's name pop up, and that's an example. They have developed a really good, strong relationship with their state SNAP agency. I'm so impressed by the trust that you have with them. So you might ask ask Mary or Katie for tips about how they develop that relationship. But it's so strong that when I emailed their one of their state directors, he called me back right away. I thought, golly. So it can be done.
Thanks,
Great.
Kate.
Sure.
Well, again, thank you so much, Kate. Obviously, you can see this has stimulated a lot of thought and discussion among our participants. Obviously, there's a lot here to take in, and I suspect we'll continue to have some questions for you. But as Kate is alluding to, this is a priority for FMC in terms of how state or how SNAP EBT programs are developed, and you can see the reasons why in terms of what it means for the longevity and the efficacy of these programs. So again, Kate, thank you so much. I'm going to give you a chance if you've got any closing thoughts before we wrap up.
No, just thank you very much and go for it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. We again
Sure.
really appreciate.
Thank you, Kate.
Of
Thanks,
course.
everybody.
There was one question, Ben, and that was somebody asked the new contract in 2021, what does that actually mean? Somebody just had a clarifying question on the map.
You know what?
Oh,
Ben, I realized this is the old map, that it's not the new one we made that was confusing. So you can ignore the different colors. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Florida, and the green states are all going to be getting new contracts this year. They're different colors because the green states are going to negotiate it together. Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Florida each negotiate independently, which is why they were different colors. I just didn't want to confuse it and make it look as though they were all doing it together.
thanks, Kate.
Sure.
All right. Thank you all. I hope you all have a wonderful wonderful rest of your day. We look forward to talking to you all again soon. Take care.
Take care.